participants are here. Denise Yike, Alaska Youth Court? Yeah. I'm sorry, I'm looking. Right here. And would you have your students, or your participants stand up, not students? Thank you for joining us. Christy Scully? She's not here. The United Youth Court of Alaska, or any of the participants here? Yeah, thank you. This, appreciate you coming, and this is obviously, you are the next generation of lawyers and judges, and I'm glad you're starting early. Also, we have some of our folks from the school district here, and I'd like to introduce them. Steve sorry, I'm Pam, and he's from curriculum director with the school district. Pam Collins, Goldenville Middle School. Carol McNeil, Bartlett High School. And Pamela Arme, I hope that was pronounced right, West High School. She's not with us. She is with us. Hi. A number of people whose names appear in the program, and I won't ask them to stand, have contributed as sponsors of this from the Bar Historians Committee and the Anchorage Young Lawyers section. We want to thank you especially for your contributions. Finally, our real sponsor, as it were, the Board of Governors, the State of Bar Association, who have been supportive and generous with us and support us over many years. And I want to thank the board for all of your support. Thank you. Are there any members here? I hope. Board members. Nobody here. There they all. Okay. Thank you very much. I will be shortly introducing Judge Stewart, and he will introduce the guests, and he will MC the program. I'd like at this time to thank the producers of KTOO Juneau for the video, The Constitution for America, and we're ready to go on the video. We hope. Thank you. I was going to ask the delegates to come up if they would. Their names are, hopefully you finished eating lunch. Stewart, I'll put you there. I'll sit here. Are we back? Yeah. At this time, I'm going to introduce Judge Stewart, who will be emceeing the program. Judge Stewart started out in the territory in 1950, clerking for Judge Folta. In 1951, he was admitted to the Alaska Bar. He worked then for a period with the Territorial Attorney General's office. There were three attorneys. J.J.R. Williams was elected Attorney General, and Another Anthony Diamond, who you've heard of.
Not Anthony, John.
Was it John?
John Diamond.
Oh, well, I got that wrong. Hopefully that's the worst that goes wrong. Judge Stewart served in the Territorial House. He was chair of the Joint House-Senate Committee on the State and Federal Relations, which called and structured the Constitutional Convention, which occurred the following year. He was elected Secretary of the Convention. He then, after the convention, was in private practice in Juneau until 1961, when he became the second administrative director of the courts. He served in that position until 1966, when he was elevated to the Superior Court in Juneau, which he served until 1981. He remains active. He's worked on the Rules Revision Committee, and he's continues to serve as a settlement judge. Without further ado, and I think most of you know Judge Stewart. Thank you.
Greetings and welcome. I'm delighted to be here with all of you on this topic. That film that you saw was mostly filmed in my living room. I was looking at my fireplace in the background. My first pleasant task is to introduce to you the individual delegates, and I think in the order of their seating, Judge Seaborn Buckalew, yeah, that's right. Jack Coghill, a former lieutenant governor. Vic Fisher from Anchorage. Katie Hurley, not a delegate, but a distinguished chief clerk of the convention. Maynard Londborg from Unalakleet. And George Sundborg, a denizen of Alaska, longtime Juneau, Fairbanks, now living in Seattle. I have notes that were done by Margaret Russell, and they outline what each delegate ought to speak about, and they limit the time to from 3 to 5 minutes. If they were to talk on all of these topics, each of them could do a half an hour, I'm sure. So I think there's a policeman somewhere in the crowd by the name of Barbara Armstrong, and she's supposed to tell me when time is up.
I'm the policeman.
Oh, you're the policeman. Okay. So I want to give a caveat to the delegates that are going to address you. There is an outline that you have been given about what you might speak about. My suggestion is that you just pick from that outline that topic or topics that you prefer to speak about. Don't try to cover all of them, or else you will quickly hear a gavel. You don't have one. You will quickly hear a gavel and be asked to sit down. So please limit your remarks to the time limit that's suggested. I've been asked to make a few opening comments. My own role in the convention was as the secretary, which was the chief administrative officer of the convention, seeing to it that the staff and the delegates got paid, and arranging for the consultants who came, generally being responsible for the overall administration of the convention. I want to indicate that Katie Hurley was the chief clerk of the convention, and she was constantly on the floor during the plenary sessions and kept the minutes and kept a record of what was happening. That was her basic function. She can elaborate on that when she speaks. I was asked to give a brief history of the statehood movement. You know, we became a territory when the Organic Act was passed by the Congress in 1913. And by 1915, the then delegate to Congress, Judge James Wickersham, saw that it didn't work and introduced the first statehood bill, either 1915 or 1916. And every delegate thereafter introduced statehood bills, but they were never favorably treated by the Congress. The problems were multiple. We did not have the right to vote for the president, as Vic Fisher told you. We did not have the right to manage the fisheries. We could not do any capital funding. We could not bond ourselves. We couldn't build structures. We couldn't build roads. The federal government ran the fish and game operations throughout the territory. I'm not going to catalog all that I can possibly think of, but those are some of the major things that were wrong with the territory of Alaska. The statehood movement took off under the leadership of Ernest Greening. When he got the 1949 session of the territorial legislature to pass legislation creating a statehood committee, which had some 14 members, and they were to promote the statehood cause. The chairman of that committee was Bob Atwood, and Bob Atwood was a newspaperman, a publicist. And the emphasis of his administration of that committee was to publicize. There was a strong support here in Anchorage, thanks to the Anchorage Times, and they formed something called Operation Statehood that publicized statehood. The bill came up in 1950, as well as the bill for the admission of Hawaii to the Union. It passed the House. Both of them, as I recall, passed the House, but neither of them passed the Senate. It's the Southern senators, who were the long-time leaders of the Senate, in the United States Senate, chairpersons of the committees, opposed. They opposed because they didn't want to dilute their own authority. They opposed because, for example, the delegation from Alaska was Democrat, the delegation from Hawaii was Republican, and the Southerners were all Democrats at that time, and didn't want that to happen. And so the bill failed. Hawaii had written the Constitution in 1950, which their voters adopted, and they thought they were on a roll, but the roll stopped in the Senate. And for the next 2 or 3 years, there was not much movement. You heard in the video the problems of the 1953 session of the legislature. It was, I would label it, a McCarthy session. They created a legislative investigating committee to find communists in the government in the territory of Alaska. They found one communist. He was a longshoreman in Skagway who professed the communist philosophical ideals. He had no role in government, no authority, and that's the only one that I know of that they ever found. But that session was a debacle. As I'm noted in the video, the House never did adjourn, they just walked off. The Senate was split evenly. There were 8 Democrats and 8 Republicans. And the president of the Senate, who took 3 weeks to be elected because of that even split, was a very helpful individual. At the end of the session, Governor Greening, who was leaving office 1953, Eisenhower had been elected, and Frank Heinzelman would take over the governor's office, asked to speak on the Senate floor. And a Democratic senator who was anti-Greening, a gentleman from Nome, whose name I won't use, said, no, the governor may not speak. But the president, the Republican from Anchorage, said yes, he should be given the courtesy, and he did. He came and closed it. Well, the next election in 1954 resulted in a sweeping victory for the Democrats. Of the 24 members of the House, 21 of them were Democrats, and of the 16 members of the Senate, 13 of them were Democrats. And not only the Democrats, but the Republicans in that session favored statehood. And so prior to the session, there was a convening of the Central Committee of the Democratic Party in Fairbanks at the home of a gentleman named Alex Miller, who was the head of the Democratic Party in Alaska at the time, nominally. And we parceled out functions. My function was to prepare for statehood. And I traveled about the country trying to find out from other states, from academics, from whoever, how do you run a convention? How do you set it up? Nobody had any experience in Alaska or really recently elsewhere. So I became, when the legislature convened in January of 1955, the chairman of the joint House and Senate Committee on Statehood and Federal Relations. Bill Egan was in the Senate at the time, and he was the vice chairman of that committee. And we wrote the bill that structured the convention and called it. And I would invite you, if you're interested, to go back and look at that legislation. The bill is Chapter 46 of the Session Laws of 1955, and it's a very different bill than had been pending in the Congress in terms of how the convention would be selected, how the delegates would be selected, and so forth. And that was the defining moment in arriving at what kind of a convention we would have. And then the Statehood Committee, as I say, had been a public relations organization, but in their charter, which was in the Session Laws of 1949, and that, if you wanted to see it, is Chapter 108 of the Session Laws of 49. They were supposed to prepare studies and get ready for the holding of the convention. At the end of the session in 55, I was selected to be the executive secretary of the Statehood Committee, charged with making the arrangements for the convention, the physical arrangements at the university, all the details, the holding of the elections of delegates and so forth. And so I worked through the summer of 1955. I was concerned that we should select our own study committee, experts as it were, to write papers on the constitutional topics that would be treated by the delegates. Bob Atwood was reluctant to have that go. Ultimately, early in June, he contracted with an organization in Chicago called Public Administration Service to write those papers. And in retrospect, Bob was 100% right and I was 100% wrong. We would not have been able to assemble our own professional staff, and Public Administration Service was able to do it very quickly. And here I want to pay some respects to John Corcoran, who was the head of the PAS staff that came to Alaska and did that work. And throughout the summer, I traveled with them, and they traveled widely through the territory, talked to business leaders, legislative leaders, city leaders, educators, got some notion on what Alaska was all about, and prepared the papers that were used by the delegates at the opening of the convention to educate them on what goes into a state constitution, what the alternatives were, what the good things were, what the bad things were. Not attempting to dictate to them what they should do, but giving them basis of information that they could make their own decisions. So when the convention assembled in November of 1955, the delegates elected their officers, elected Bill Egan to be the chairperson. There was an election for the secretary, and I was in competition with my dear friend Katie Hurley to be the secretary. I was elected and quickly hired her to be the chief clerk of the convention, and we were off to a running start. The delegates spent the first week in committee reviewing those documents that we had provided, those study documents that we had provided So they had a foundation on what goes into a state constitution when they began their work. I'm going to run out of my time. Barbara, you're going to cut me off? All right. Just a couple of points on the selection of the location of the convention. I think a lot of people thought the convention would naturally be at the Capitol. But I had met Mrs. Katzenbach, who was the vice president of the New Jersey Convention in '46. Her son, Nick Katzenbach, who was at the Yale Law School was graduated the year I arrived there, later became the Attorney General of the United States under President Johnson. She said, hold your convention at the state university. We didn't have a state university. We weren't yet a state. But we did have a university. They had held their convention at Rutgers. And she said that avoided the entrenched lobbying interest that exist in the capital city and would give the convention an academic surrounding. And so when we wrote the bill, Chapter 46, the committee in the legislature of 55, we specified that it should be at Fairbanks. If there's any one decision that I hope to be proud of as long as I live, it's that one. That's where the convention should be, and where, if there were another one, which I think there should not be, that it might similarly be held there. I think that's enough for me to say, and I'm going to turn to the participants and give them their time on the floor, and I'm going to call them in the order in which basically they are seated here. But as I warned at the beginning, 3 to 5 minutes. and we'll start out with Judge Buckalew.
Well, managed that trip safely. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm just glad to be here and glad I participated in the Constitutional Convention. And in my judgment, the delegates did a first-class job, and I'm happy that I participated. And that's the extent of my comments. And thank you.
Buck, you gave somebody else some valuable minutes. I had thought that he was going to comment a little bit about the work of the Committee on the Judiciary, of which he was a member, chaired by George McLaughlin. And I just want to tell you one little thing about that article. Over the next 40 years, I was very close to a gentleman named Jay Rabinowitz, who was for many years the Chief Justice of the Alaska court system, as I think most of you might know. And Jay reiterated to me not once, not twice, but many times how fortunate Alaska was to have the article on the judiciary that we do have. It structured a court system that is the envy across the nation. I and he and others often went to the National Judicial College in Reno, Nevada, and met other judges from other jurisdictions, and they say, in effect, I wish the hell we had something like that. It's an excellent article, and Judge Buckalew was one of the prime authors of that provision. Next, I shall call on Lieutenant Governor Coghill, delegate from Nenana, and Jack, you have an outline of things you might touch on. Select those that you think are most important.
Thank you, Judge. It's really a pleasure to be here, and you know, we're dwindling in numbers. There was 55 of us to start with, and now there's 8 of us, 7 of us left. And I'm the youngest, by the way. And I'll probably be around for a long, long time. But I think that what I would like to do is to touch on just 2 items. And one of them is that the reapportionment, and during the territorial days, if you didn't live in the big city, you were out of luck. It took an awful lot of time. In fact, I got elected in 1953 because I owned an airplane and because my dad had a gas station, and because we had credit all the way up the Kuskokwim and the Yukon rivers, and every place I went, why, they knew the name Coghill, and I knew how I could get gasoline for my airplane, and so I was able to get elected to the territorial legislature in '53. And of course, once you get elected, you think that, well, now I've succeeded in doing that, it's going to be a snap next time around, and it wasn't. The tide turned, and of course, I had to sit out the '55 legislature, but I then took my airplane and took out for the Kuskokwim Yukon district, which was the district that was established for the Constitution, and was handily elected and served in the Constitutional Convention. And because of my relationship with Bill Egan, who was a grocery man from Valdez, and I was a grocery man from Nenana, somehow or other, the fluke being that we were not in the majority, there was no political party structure in it, but I became the chairman of the administrative committee. We had $300,000. They appropriated $300,000 for us to run the convention. We decided, after many, many days of debate, to allocate $262,000. And of course, everybody was saying, well, there's that conservative Coghill out there. He's pinching the pennies and pinching the pennies, and rightfully so, because after many days, why, we were able to put together a program where that we would pay the delegates $20 a day per dime, and we would pay them a salary of $15 a day. And this was in 1953, 55, 56, and we were able to establish that. And then we put together our program. We came down to 262,000. If you go into the minutes of the Constitutional Convention, it was very turmoil. We're bouncing around all over the place, but I thought maybe Seaborn, my friend Seaborn, might have hit on that a little bit, because that's when I got to really know who Seaborn Buckalew was, because he put me in a cannon and shot me out of the cannon 2 or 3 times. But then what we did is that we allocated, we ended up with $33,000 that we turned back to the Statehood Committee for them to be able to publish the end document and to be able to put together the election for the ratification. We saved $5,000 of it was for the Tennessee Plan. And you remember that during the Constitutional Convention, we put together a plan that was called the Tennessee Plan, where we elected 2 senators and a representative, and we sent them back to Washington, and we said, we demand to be heard. We demand to be seated. Well, Tennessee got away with it. Alaska didn't. Bartlett and Greening and Rivers was our House member, and Egan and Greening were our senators, and they finally set up shop in a office building right close to the Capitol, and they lobbied everybody, and that was probably one of the success stories of the Constitutional Convention, was getting the Tennessee Plan going. So that was one of the pluses of the convention. Plus, the fact is that where I worked the most on was on the reapportionment, because in territorial days you had just 4 judicial districts, and we put together a program where that we had by apportionment the election districts, and they were divided, and in fact we're still using pretty much the same basic format of that. So I think that we don't need a new convention. We don't need to have another constitutional convention right now, because we haven't exhausted the amending process, number one. And number two is that I'd hate to see what would happen, because under the article that we had in the Constitution, if you have a constitutional convention, it has to be a wide open convention. So my recommendation to you folks is when you go to the polls, vote no. Which one here?
Thank you very much, Jack. And next, Victor Fisher, whom you all know because he's a fellow Anchorageite. He was chairman of the Committee on Local Government, and I think he might focus on that subject.
Thank you, Tom. Thanks to the bar historians for bringing all of us together, including my daughter Ruth Fisher, my wife Jane Angvik. It's a pleasure to be here. And I'm particularly appreciative that those of us who are the survivors get to be here together. Jack was actually, he was the second youngest of the convention. Tommy Harris was the youngest. But I'm just slightly older than Jack, and I think I'll be around for a long time, too. By the way, if anybody would like to see, this is a copy of the original Constitution with the signatures, if you want to take a look at it afterward. I would just like to quickly touch on a couple of subjects. When the delegates came to Fairbanks, to the university, statehood was, of course, a big issue, but there was also a lot of talk about how we structure the executive branch, the governorship, the legislature, what kind of a court system. But, and people had ideas because we knew we had federal courts, but we knew what courts were like. We could look at other states and see how they've done it. Bob Bartlett gave the keynote address at the opening of the Constitutional Convention, and what Bob said was it was a whole speech, but the emphasis was that the way we manage Alaska's resources in the long run, the tremendous endowment that would come with statehood, is the way we would be judged in the long run, and that's how the Constitution would be judged 50 years hence. Well, we're almost there. And one of the things that we have accomplished under statehood is that we have managed our resources very effectively. And the resource article, it was sort of slow coming into shape because unlike other parts of the Constitution, there were no models for the resource article. There was no state that had a comprehensive resource article. There were water states, there were mining states, there were states that had land provisions in the Constitution, but no state had a comprehensive article. And we had a consultant who came up with a set of proposals, but this was, what's in the Constitution was truly written by the delegates assembled. The other sort of innovative article was on local government. We came into statehood. Prior to statehood, we had cities, and we had no other general government. We didn't have counties. Congress specifically, when in the Organic Act, prohibited the territorial legislature from establishing counties. The reason, of course, was that they were influenced by the mining industry, by the fishing industry. They were controlled from outside, and they didn't want to be taxed. So there was no tax structure outside urban areas. Public utility districts were established around cities. There were area-wide school districts because growth went past city boundaries. But the issue before the convention is, what do we do? The local government committee essentially looked at experience of all the other states, other countries, Finland. Thanks to Yul Kilcher, we looked at Switzerland, and we sort of mentally traveled all over the world and essentially learned what not to do. And we didn't want a rigid system as counties that became obsolete. They've modernized since 1955, but at that point, counties really weren't functioning at all, and many still aren't in most states. And so essentially, we started from scratch, cities, and there were several major policy decisions. We did not want proliferation of local governing units, as in the Chicago metropolitan area, you have 2,000 different taxing jurisdictions. So there's a provision for maximum local self-government with minimum number of governmental units. We have a very strong home rule provision, the strongest of all the states in the Union. Local governments are given the given legislative powers under home rule, and local municipalities can exercise any power, any legislative power not specifically denied by law or by their own charter. So we set up a system where you had boroughs, which was, the name was sort of pulled out of a hat after a lot of argument over whether it should be counties or cantons or something else. And boroughs prevailed. But the concept was that the entire state would be divided into organized and unorganized areas, that people in local areas would have an opportunity to decide whether to be organized or not. However, the state would have final jurisdiction over boundaries so that there would be flexibility in the long run, and the state would be given a role. The resource article has worked. The local government article has not been implemented as effectively because we still have this amorphous, unorganized borough. On the other hand, the self-government home rule provision has worked very effectively through consolidation in places like Juneau, Douglas, in Anchorage, home rule, and extended to North Slope Borough, Northwest Arctic Borough. You've got it down on the Alaska Peninsula into the Aleutian Chain. So essentially, we're still evolving the local government system.
Vic, I'm going to call time in 1 minute. You have used your time and Buck's time.
Well, okay. Let me just, since I have Buck's time, let me just mention that. On a videotape, there was discussion of election of the president of the Constitutional Convention. We then had, following that, we had an election of vice president of the Constitutional Convention, and the competition was between Ralph Rivers, who had been one of the people who was a candidate for the presidency of the convention. He didn't make it, obviously. But he was nominated as a candidate for the vice presidency. And the other person nominated was Frank Peratrovich, who was a territorial senator. He was from Klawock. He was the only native in the Alaska Constitutional Convention. And there were sort of speeches about the nomination, and then nominations were closed, and Mildred Herman was presiding, and she called for the vote on the vice presidency, and Buckalew said, "Madam Chair, how do you spell Peratrovich?" And everybody laughed, and Peratrovich was elected vice president of the convention. Thank you.
Thank you, Vic. He brought a copy of the Constitution, and so did I. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that at the end. I won't take the time now. And next on the list is Katie to talk about the operation of the plenary sessions. Hurley. Katie Hurley.
I'm not going to talk about that. Everybody knows what a plenary session is. I will touch on some of what a great decision they made in choosing Bill Egan to be the chair, because he was so inclusive that even the average guy or woman was given equal treatment with the lawyers. And so the lawyers did not dominate the debates. And there were times when he would anticipate someone who was new to the parliamentary procedure would get up and try to, and he could sense that they were wanting to make a motion, so he would call a recess, and he'd call them up into the chair, and I was sitting right in front of him, so I was privy to all this these quiet little conversations. And he would say, I think you acted like you might want to make a motion. And he helped them get the words together, and then they went back. The average age was 50, and the oldest person was Mr. Collins, who had been in the first territorial legislature, and the youngest person was Tommy Harris from Valdez. And it's unbelievable how old I thought he was. He was 82. And now, in my 81st year, I think I'm real young. I was sitting in the very right below this elevated place that they had put the president, and it was a job that I never felt was a job. It was the greatest privilege of my life to be there, and I had worked in the governor's office for 12 years under Ernest Greening, and I had been the secretary of the Senate. So all of these people that were there were really familiar to me, except a couple. And to watch them grow during that session of the Constitutional Convention was absolutely a thrill. And when I read those minutes, their voices ring in my ears. One of the comments that they said, who do you think was the most effective participant? And maybe that was for just the delegates to talk about, but I have a few opinions. Besides Bill E., outside of the fact that the convention would not have been as effective as it was without the leadership of Bill Egan, there was Jimmy Dugan, who was from Fairbanks, and he had served on, I think, the city council, and he was not afraid to get up and speak. And he had a wonderful sense of humor and added so much to the convention. And he and his wife were very gracious to me and included me often to come over to their house for dinner. And I remember young Mike Dugan running around the house, being quite a devil then. He hasn't changed too much, I'm glad to say. My friend Burke Riley, who is not here, and I had a good visit with him last week in Juneau. His health isn't too good, but he told me a story about Bill Egan and the rules. Burke, having been the chair of the Rules Committee, had drafted some very good rules for the convention. And Bill, having known parliamentary procedure, and he had read the rules, and he ran the convention wonderfully. But towards the end of the convention, I think it was after Burke said it was probably in January, Bill came up to him and said, "You know, I don't have a copy of the rules. Don't you think I should have a copy?" And Burke said he made some smart remark to him about it, and gave him a copy. But that was the kind of a leader he was. He knew the rules and had memorized them enough that he didn't have to have them sitting in front of him. There were some of my other favorites. The interchange between Judge Buckalew and John Hellenthal was added a lot of levity at times, although I don't know that they thought it was funny. But to me, it was very entertaining. And those young guys, Barry White and Vic Fisher, I thought they were just terrific. And Mildred Herman, who was she had served on the statehood committee, and she was the mother of a friend of mine. We'd gone to school together in Juneau, and she was the conscience of the convention. When she thought things were moving too slowly, she'd stand up and she had this rolling pin. And she'd say, "Now we got to get down to business. You know, the time's going," and it encouraged everyone. And then there was Steve McCutcheon, who sat right in front of me, and he was always taking my picture and embarrassing me when I would see him snapping his camera. And Jim Hurley, who at that time was a farmer, said he was a farmer from the valley, but he actually had studied law, but he had never practiced law. And I think I'm running out of time, but I do want to tell one story about Jim. That I later married him, but there was nothing going on during the convention. I met him later when he was elected to the legislature in Juneau, and that was 4 years later. But he was very articulate, and he was very conscientious. He was living alone in a little cabin out by I didn't even know that. He told me this after we were married, but near the campus of the university. And he said it was pretty lonely because he would go home. He didn't get downtown where some of us would gather after the convention and visit and have a few drinks now and then. And anyway, the convention was discussing the Bill of Rights, and there was a motion, an amendment to exclude wiretapping, and they passed it. And Jim took it home that night and studied it, and came back the next morning and spoke to the chairman of the Rules Committee and others, and said, "I think that the wording that we have adopted allows wiretapping." And after a tremendous discussion and debate, everyone agreed, and they rescinded their action, and the vote was exactly about the same on the other side. And he was that way with a lot of the articles. And another person I wish to pay a tribute to is George McLaughlin, who, with his tenacity and his leadership, that wonderful judicial article would never have come to fruition. I could go on and on, but I think my time is up.
Thank you very much, Katie. Did you get away with some of my papers? No. Well, I'm missing some then. Thank you. Thank you. That's better. I'm glad you had a chance to listen to Katie, because she gave you a personal view of the convention that otherwise you probably would not have had. And next is Maynard Londborg from Unalakleet. Maynard.
Thank you, Judge. One of the things that I remember very distinctly, and I believe that this helped us to, especially in the final days when we were determined to finish on time, and that is the sense of humor that prevailed throughout the convention. This was, I feel, very, very, very important. If I was to give my views of the important issues and whether the Constitution dealt with them, I would select the uncertainty of the future. Oil had not been discovered yet, I don't believe. We had no idea of even the mineral resources in the state. And you'll notice if you read the Constitution, over and over, it states that as the legislature may provide, not being able to predict the future, it was impossible, I think, to draw up the Constitution dealing with everything. And that, to me, was very important, as the legislature may provide. Then also another important issue is this matter of not saying that it could not be amended, but rather that every 10 years there be a constitutional convention. One of the reasons I believe for this was the fact that, again, the uncertainty of the future. But I notice in reading the current document that there have been many amendments, so the amendment process does work under the current Constitution. Whether there should be another convention or not, again, we trusted the future generations to decide that. One of the obvious things that would happen if we had a constitutional convention today would be the very, very high cost of getting elected. I don't know how much each delegate spent. Didn't have time to raise money, and some just a few dollars probably on postage, and that was about it. But when you realize how much people spend a day to get elected as a senator, representative, governor, or whatever you have, you can imagine how much would be have to be raised to be a delegate in a future convention. Says, who do you think was the most important participant? I wouldn't be able to answer that, but I know one that wasn't. And who do you think was the most interesting participant in the convention? Two come to my mind, and they pretty much tie, and that would be Yule Kilcher and Muktuk Marson. They were interesting characters to have at the convention. And I feel that they contributed a lot in their own way, but in a very interesting way as well. I think that covers pretty much the remarks that I would make at this time. Thank you.
Your program had noted that Burke Radley would be here, and as Katie has told you, he felt unable to come. I spoke with him a couple of days ago, and he reiterated that he was not able to be with you, and I'm sorry. But we have finally George Sundborg, who I think I told you before was a denizen of Alaska, but lives in Seattle. George.
We're indeed pleased and honored to be here in the company of so many lawyers. I've been around lawyers quite a bit in Alaska, I arrived here early enough to hear the redoubtable James Wickersham give a keynote speech at a convention in Juneau. When I was outside during World War II working for the U.S. State Department, I was in Portland, Oregon. A young man telephoned me and he said he was a lawyer and he wondered if he could talk with me about what opportunities there might be for lawyers in Alaska. I had written a book called Opportunity in Alaska. So I had lunch with him and told him what the opportunities looked like to me, and he came up here. He stayed around for quite a while. His name was Wendell Kay. So much has been covered by the other speakers that I'm skipping over quite a bit of my notes. It was mentioned that the oldest delegate in the convention was Ernest B. Collins of Fairbanks, a member of the bar. He was one of 3 then living representatives from the first legislature held at Juneau first territorial legislature held at Juneau in 1913. That happens to be the year in which I was born. The other 2 who were still alive at the time of our convention were Charlie Jones of Nome and Henry Roden of All Points in Alaska, who had been the Attorney General of this territory. When we assembled 47 years ago, that's quite a while, isn't it? I remember that Tom Stewart and Jack and Vic, they all had hair at that time. Yeah, so did I. Thank you. We found that we had 12 lawyers present as delegates, 3 commercial fishermen, 2 miners, 2 bush pilots, 2 preachers, an architect, and for some reason, 5 druggists. Of the, there were 49 men and 6 women. All are gone now except 7. I am the eldest of the 7. I'm in my 90th year. I have lived a wonderful life, much of it in Alaska. The average length of time of the delegates who wrote the Constitution was 27.5 years prior to the holding of the Constitutional Convention. So there was a lot of experience there. As to who was the most effective member, I would say the MVP was Bill Egan. He set the tone of the convention. A wonderful meeting where the participants did not represent special interests. They represented everybody's interest. And their only agenda was to write the very best Constitution that could be written, and they did it. John Bebot has been mentioned. He was with the National Municipal League. He died about a year ago. He said of the Alaska Constitution that it was literally written by the delegates and convention assembled. It was more truly a do-it-yourself convention on the part of the delegates than any other in modern times. It is hard to convince audiences in the lower 48 that this is so. They simply don't understand the very high level of sophistication, intellectual experience, philosophic breadth, and practical experience represented by the 55 delegates. And they can hardly imagine how hard and single-mindedly you Alaskans worked at the job. The convention produced a document that was a rare blend of the classic principles embodied first and best in the U.S. Constitution and of modern or innovative features altogether compatible with those principles which made the Alaska Constitution more distinctly appropriate to its time and place than any other state constitution. We really worked over 48 other state constitutions at the time we met, and we debated every proposal up one side and down the other, and we came out, I think, with a very rare and a very valuable document. Maynard Londborg mentioned that we provided that there would be a constitutional convention every 10 years. We didn't do exactly that. We provided that there would be a vote by the people of Alaska of whether there should be another constitutional convention every 10 years. I know a proposal has been made that be amended to every 20 years. I don't think in God's world you'll ever get a group as dedicated to the result that they were going to produce, anything like the ones that we had in 1955-56. I want to speak a little bit, a very little bit about it, because it doesn't have to be emphasized. The role of Tom Stewart was vital to what happened at the convention. He was wonderful in the territorial legislature of 1955, which authorized the holding of a convention, and he was undaunted in going after expert consultants for us to serve during the convention. I'm asked to say a little bit about Kim Owen. It has been mentioned, Kim Owen died in an airplane crash just after the Alaska Constitution had been adopted by the voters in Alaska. He was the consultant to my committee, which was the Committee on Style and Drafting. We had the difficult task of trying to make a unified document out of a dozen different parts, which had been worked up separately by committees, Committee on the Legislature, Committee on the Judiciary, and so on, and to have all the language stand and be understood by anybody who read the Constitution. And we would work night and day. At night, we would meet together, the members of the committee, and work over another of the chapters of the Constitution. And then in the daytime, we would have the major session on the floor where we would have to defend what we were suggesting be changed. And we were never wanted to make any change in the meaning of the chapters that had been provided, but only in the form so that the document would stand up against all challenges. Unknown at the time, and very remarkable in retrospect, was the fact that within 3 years of the end of the Constitutional Convention, we were a state. There had been no expectation of that. We were working sort of in a world where we were just dealing with propositions and trying to think what was best. And here we were going to on January the 3rd, 1959, we were admitted to the Union. I think one of the reasons we were is that the Constitutional Convention itself was a proving ground. It showed what the people of Alaska could do in the way of providing self-government for themselves. And that was as important as the Alaska-Tennessee Plan in convincing the Congress that Alaska was entitled to become the 49th state. I've often been asked since I left Alaska. I went to Washington from Alaska because I was chosen as the administrative assistant of one of the 2 United States senators to whom we were entitled when we became a state. I've been asked, well, did you bring any gold out of Alaska? Oh, no, I didn't bring an ounce of gold. How about an oil lease or two? No, never occurred to me. What did you bring out of Alaska? I brought the satisfaction that comes to a person who has had the opportunity to form the framework for a brand new state, which is one of the great states of the United States, and in the future I think will become a very heavily populated state. Alaska has everything that people want. It has natural beauty, it has great resources. This is a marvelous, marvelous state. I don't know why I'm breaking down here. It's because I'm so old, I think. So now you have met a living fossil, you know? I'm not only the oldest delegate still alive, I'm the only one still remaining of the 7 who were elected statewide. One of the questions asked in the outline is, who did you run against? Well, I think about 30 people filed for that one office, and so I ran against 29 others, and I was fortunate to be one of the 7 elected. I think I've said all that I have time to do, and I thank you all for your attention.
I'm not going to take much more of your time if I can reorganize the notes that everybody took from me. I want to comment just a little bit about why the question is now before you, shall there be a constitutional convention? Other than George and maybe 1 or 2 others, I don't think many remember that in 1955, across the nation, legislatures were dominated, especially in the Senate body, by rural peoples, and they would not approve a reapportionment for their state. They could not get a constitution. People from the populated centers could not get a constitutional convention because of this representation on a geographic basis. And that was the issue when the delegates considered, should there be a constitutional convention every 10 years? It was not something that suggested that there ought to be, but only that the people would have the chance to say. Now, the reason for it that I have described, a disproportionate representation in state legislatures of rural peoples, was obviated in 1962 when the United States Supreme Court published the opinion in Baker versus Carr, which was followed by Reynolds versus Sims in 1964, and the Supreme Court held that states' system of legislative apportionment was unconstitutional as a violation of the Equal Protection Clause, and all state legislatures must be apportioned on a basis of the population, 1 man, 1 vote. So that the basic reason for that provision being there was obviated when the Supreme Court made that decision. And I think it's helpful and instructive to understand that background of that question and how it got to be there. I'm not suggesting that it shouldn't be there. The people should be able to decide whether it's needed. But I'm going to stand up and tell you it's not. And I'm not going to catalog the reasons why I think that, but for one, there were no lobbyists. The only lobby in Fairbanks was educational lobbyists, the superintendents of schools. And they submitted a proposed article on education, which was about 3.5 pages long, single-spaced. And if you look in our Constitution, the provision on education is 1 paragraph, I think about 3 sentences. And that's instructive on what a constitution ought to be. It ought not to deal with the detail that had been offered by the lobbyists. Now, if there were a convention today, I suspect not just the presence of moneyed lobbyists at the halls of the convention, but particularly in the election of delegates. Money would be behind those who would run. And money talks. And where the money has been provided by some vested interest that wishes to have its interest promoted, that's the kind of a convention I suspect you might get. And if you look at our Constitution, it's acclaimed across the nation as probably the best of all the states. And there are issues out there, the subsistence issue, that need to be treated by the amendment process, but it does not require a wholesale revision. I'm not going to take more of your time, except I want to tell you just a little anecdote about the writing of the Constitution. As I said, I brought a copy, as did Vic, of an original document. You know, there is no single original Constitution of the state of Alaska. When the Committee on Style and Drafting wrote, every evening when they finished their work, I would take it to the Newsminer and they would publish galley proofs. And the committee would work from the galley proofs. And eventually, when that was completed, they printed 100 copies. Now, 61 of them were signed by the delegates, 55 for each delegate to have one for the President of the United States, one for the Congress, one for the Senate, one for the House, one for the Governor of Alaska, and one for the Secretary of Alaska. That's 60. The 61st was on genuine sheepskin parchment. And of that 33,000 that Jack Coghill mentioned was left over, 10,000 of it was spent to get the chief calligrapher of the United States government to write in calligraphy a copy of the Constitution. And if you happen to be in the museum in Juneau, you can see that document. But the delegates lined up on the last day alphabetically, and I had laid out signature sheets, 61 of them, 60 from this document and one from that sheepskin parchment. And they walked down the tables and they all signed their names 61 times. And the other 39 copies of the 100, I selected the best signature page. Some of the signature pages were not so good. Delegates had smudged the ink, or otherwise it didn't show up clearly. I took the best page and it was photographed by the Newsminer, and it was put into those other 39 copies. And so there were actually 100 copies of the Constitution written, not a single individual one. And I'm told historically, though I'm not an historian, that the same thing happened in the United States Constitution. There is an original signed one that appears in the lobby of the Capitol, but actually the document was printed and there were many copies. And we followed that history. I thought that was a little story about it that there's an interest. If any of you want to look at this copy and see that signature page, I'll have it here and you can take a look at it after we adjourn. And I think we've now run out of time. Leroy, it's up to you.
Thank you. Appreciate all of you being here and joining us and sharing with us your experiences. We have a couple things to show our appreciation. Barbara, you want to help me? Did we get the Great Harvest Bakery, which Barbara and her husband own, has graciously provided a loaf of bread in our state colors for each of you. And I might say, while she's passing those out, there is one loaf on each table, and the one that has a star on the back of their program gets to take it home. So you better look for the sun. And since the hour is getting late, I won't ask each of the delegates to stand, but we do have a certificate of appreciation. Judge Stewart? Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for being here.
Thank you.
Would you mind? I managed to get it out of the container there, but, and here, let me make sure you...